Hello and most welcome to Heidegger 1500. We are currently at the Old Dub where the Jubilee session is going to be recorded. And here we have one of the attendants.
Matthias, my name is Matthias. We are on Old Dub. You are very welcome.
It's an excellent pub, isn't it?
It is.
How many beers do you got?
Oh, many. Many. On tap, 10.
Wow!
On tap.
That's amazing.
We have on bottle also.
And you got food as well?
Of course.
Thank you very much, Matthias. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you.
And we continue. We press continue. Yes. We will do the 1500th episode at this very pub, the Old Dub, in Stockholm. Very close to the Hay Square, Hötorget, where we've just been shopping exclusive meats. Venison, for instance, and asparagus fresh from the season. Today, an event perhaps, a book by Peter Salmon, a biography of Jacques Derrida. And I just read in the introduction that maybe the most marvelous philosopher of all, Jacques Derrida, was invited to this very conference in view of just attending. When they considered him, they said at least he will not refuse the invitation. So 1966 this started, and he later, when the decades went, became the most popular philosopher in the French soil, maybe one of the most prominent ever to be founded at this very conference. And as I mentioned earlier on in the prequel, was that this was also the death of existentialism. It happened in this very conference of 1966. And let me just mention some of the names here. I'm sad for the repetition, but we had as speakers Roland Barthes, Hans-Georg Gadamer, Northrop Frye, Svetan Todorov, Jacques Lacan, Joseph Miller, and Paul de Man. The only absent really was Michel Foucault.
No, snyft.
And I was just mentioning Maxi here. Maxi had organized a conference to introduce structuralism to America.
You have to mention his car. Rolls Royce.
Yeah, he had a Rolls Royce, apparently. It was already the dominant theoretical discipline in France, having displaced the existentialism of Sartre, de Beauvoir, and Camus. And as Maxi noted in his opening address, structuralism called into question the notion of the subject. Call into question the idea of the subject. I will just try it out. Maybe we should take a little pause here. Structuralism. Structuralism was, in a sense, a reaction to a certain romanticizing of the cogito by existentialism. It challenged the primacy of consciousness and the individual as the seat of meaning. Where conscious human being existed within a structural field, it was not what that person reckoned as a sovereign instigator of meaning. Rather, human culture, including human beings, need to be understood in terms of relationships to a broader conceptual grid. To understand an object, or indeed a subject, insofar as the designation is allowed, one looks at its position in the grid, at how it differs or is similar to the things around it. Every system has a structure, and the position of each element within the structure is dictated by the structure, and that's the important point. It's the structure that dictates. There is no surplus. The matrix is the whole. It was from two unexpected thinkers that the intellectual terrain of structuralism emerged, and a critique of each was central to Derrida's paper. Ferdinand de Saussure and Claude Lévi-Strauss could not have been more different from each other, nor could they have imagined the impact their work would have outside their seemingly narrow disciplines of linguistics and anthropology, respectively. In fact, Saussure published little in his lifetime, and much of what he did publish, such as his work on Lithuanian linguistics, despite his inability to speak the language, is the source of some embarrassment. He was born in Geneva in 1857, and as a young linguistic teacher, he cut his teeth studying such things as primitive vowel systems in the Indo-European languages, the topic of his first and only full-length book. He lived a mostly blameless life, lecturing on Gothic and High German in Paris, and Sanskrit and Indo-European at the University of Geneva. Before becoming obsessed with the search for anagrams in Greek and Latin poems. He was fascinated for reasons known only to himself by the idea that poets encoded the name of certain gods in their poems. In the end, this obsession generated 8 boxes of notebooks and sketches and new publications. And in 1907, the sudden death of a colleague forced him to add to his teaching a loaded course in general linguistics for beginner students. The lectures, which he gave until 1911, caused little fuss at the time, and he was more than happy to return to his more niche concerns when they were discontinued. On his death in 1913, the lectures remained unpublished as they remained until they were collected by his former students Charles Bally and Albert Sechay and published firstly in 1916 based on the notes and recollections. Course in General Linguistics is one of the most influential books of the 20th century, its impact spreading far beyond the field of linguistics and into philosophy, anthropology, the social sciences, semiotics, psychoanalysis, and feminism as well. Feminism. Russian formalism later incorporated its findings wholesale. Both structuralism and post-structuralism regarded it as a fundamental text. My commentator, Saussure, is the founder of structuralism. He's the first. So that's where it starts. It starts, oddly enough, in linguistics.
Think about Strauss. Saussure. Saussure. Structuralism. And Saussure.
Spreading far beyond the field of linguistics and into philosophy, anthropology, the social sciences, semiotics, psychoanalysis, and feminism. It's a great expanse, and still today it's the dominant in these areas. Russian formalism later incorporated its findings wholesale. Both structuralism and post-structuralism regard it as a fundamental text. When Saussure wrote in the course for the study of language to remain solely the business of a handful of specialists would be a quite unacceptable state of affairs. In practice, the study of language is in some degree or other the concern of everyone. He had no notion of how wide this set of everyone might become, or how deep that concern went. His basic insight was, indeed, basic but revolutionary. First, Saussure wished to distinguish between language as it is used, actual utterances, and the whole system of language that which precedes speech and makes it possible. The former he termed parole, the latter langue. Langue is the structure of language that allows for meaningful utterances. Parole is the utterances themselves. So he makes a division between two things, which is very typical. Later, as you can recall, one of these things is going to be marginalized and the other one is going to get prioritized. So that is the magic of structuralism and many other tendencies in modern philosophy. This structure operates as a system of signs, and signs are made up of two components: the signifier, which is the sound image, such as apple tree, and the signified, the actual tree. The object to which the signifier refers. that thing over there made of wood and full of fruit. So it's a direct distinction here. Crucially, the relationship between the signifier and the signified is arbitrary. That is also very important. It is completely arbitrary, random, hereby establishing the idea that language itself is random. It doesn't have order to it. It doesn't have a heritage. It could be anything. Instead of apple tree, it could be a bumblebee and still mean apple tree. A sort of devious thing come in here. The signifier cat does not embody catness. We could use any other signifier, as foreign languages show us. Jacques does the job in French, Paca in Swahili. In French, for instance, mouton means both mutton, the cut of the meat from an older animal, and living sheep. Why the English reserve it for the latter. Lamb works in the opposite way. Saussure was not the first to identify the arbitrary nature of the relationship between signifier and signified. John Locke had previously drawn attention to the situation in his essay concerning human understanding already in 1689, while Aristotle had referred to the relationship as conventional. That is, a matter of convention rather than necessity. So randomness is sneaking in here. Convention is the same as randomness, one could say. But Saussure was the first to argue that not only are the signifiers arbitrary, but so are the signifieds. The thing out there is also arbitrary. Traditionally, the world had been seen as a world of objects.
Is it
Objects.
Is it dead?
Check, could be that. Language named these objects things, ideas. As noted, an object may have a different name, but the thing name still retains its discrete existence. But for Saussure, language is not simply a system of representation, of labeling. Rather, it is a system of articulation in which the naming creates the object. Saussure illustrates this by comparing words to money. If I want to know the meaning of a £5 note, I require two things. First, I need to know the number of things I can exchange for it. Cartons of milk, for instance. But second, I need to be able to compare it to two other denominations, euros or dollars, and to other values in the same denomination. How does it compare to £10? To understand a given signifier, one must compare it with similar values with other words that stand in opposition to it. These signifiers form a matrix, a conceptual grid that we impose on the world to make sense. Put the grid on the world to make it understandable. That is very important actually. It's the grid-like feature of structuralism that has caused so much attraction from, for instance, anthropology, psychology and cultural studies. I will repeat it because it's so damn good. Sorry about the swear word. These signifiers form a matrix, a conceptual grid that we impose on the world to make it make sense.
Grid.
And this, oh wait here, this this conceptual grid creates the signifiers. So you see there are two things here. It's the grid that makes the signifiers, but it's also the signifiers constructing the grid. And this is very similar to initial conditions and classical laws, as so clearly exposed by Lee Smolin and Roberto Unger. How we, by creating one thing, make the other thing dependent of the first thing. And all of a sudden, we have two things coming out of nowhere, actually.
Please translate grid into Swedish.
Come again?
Grid in Swedish. Grid.
Grid.
Girighet.
Nej, grid alltså faktorn, alltså rutnät.
Rutnät, ja, tack. Sorry, we had just a translation here. Grid is rutnät. Like a chicken net. You can see it as a chicken net. These signifiers form a matrix, a conceptual grid that we impose. I like this, impose on the world. The world is already out there somehow. To make it make sense. Otherwise, it would make sense. Yeah. And this concept. No, not really. Everything is absolutely passive. It doesn't take you to be active in the world. You can just sit and look around and the world will come to you. What is the key here is that each signifier gets its validity not from some quality of itself. Rather, it gets it from how it differs from other signifiers. Cat is cat and not cat. Okay. Because it differs in one of its phonemes. Language is a system of differences. And this is true of every word within language. There are no first words that exist and from which differences and relations emerge. Rather, the things emerge from the differences and relations. An emergence that has no end and that can never be complete. As Saussure put it, language is a system of differences without positive terms. There are no positive terms. Derrida's difference attempts to capture this same idea. A difference without origin, without end. Always delayed, important. Delayed and deferred. Because it takes time to put the grid on the world and thereby get meaning. So it's a delay and it's a deferral. To pin down a point of origin is not only false, but an act of violence. It may be a useful one, but it is invalid within the system presented. In the beginning isn't the word. In the beginning is difference. So according to Levi-Strauss and later with Saussure, all is about difference, nothing else. There's no origin, there's no truth.
Relationships between the objects.
Yeah, we can say only relationships, nothing stable, not anything that can constitute something stable in itself. Nothing means anything in itself. It's a system in flux. For Claude Lévi-Strauss, anthropology, the study of human behavior and societies, was also an analysis of conceptual grids, of matrices of meaning. Born in Paris in 1908, the son of a portrait painter, Lévi-Strauss studied law and philosophy before, almost by accident, taking up a position at the University of São Paulo in Brazil as a writing professor in sociology. He and his then wife spent 1935 to 39 in anthropological fieldwork in Mato Grosso and the Amazonian rainforests. After passing the war years in the United States, Lévi-Strauss produced his first major work, The Elementary Structures of Kingship, published in 1949. Instead of analyzing human relationships by looking at their content, as previous anthropological theories had, Lévi-Strauss sought out the deep structures that underlay how the relationship came into being. He also studied what relationships were forbidden within society. For Lévi-Strauss, the ne plus ultra of prohibition is the incest taboo, which occurs universally within a given society by circumscribing the possibility of incest. Members of a clan, men invariably were forced to look outside the clan for a marriage partner. This prohibition thus functioned to, for instance, build alliances and widen the gene pool. It also leads to the circulation of women, a point Derrida took up later in writings about the idea of reciprocity and a gift. This is a structuralist notion of agency. Unlike, say, for Sartre, for whom the individual is the hero of his or her own story. Here, the individual's acts are dictated by a system outside of her or his own activity. So your activity has nothing to do with the system at all. They are completely separated. Lévi-Strauss' other structural gambit was to explore the function and construction of myths, particularly in his 4-volume work, Mythologiques, published between 1964 and 1971. Levi-Strauss was fascinated by the fact that myths, which are completely open in what they can contain, from flying horses to wicked stepmothers, seem to exhibit similarities across cultures and across time. He posited that this sameness was at the level of structure. Thus, listen now, he expanded the whole idea to cover more and more. We are approaching the apocalypse, if you like. Thus, the parole of a given myth is the story itself as it is recited around a fire, in a book, through dance, in song. The log, on the other hand, the underlying conceptual grid, remains as a narrative vehicle for universal meanings beyond history and news. It is put together according to certain rules, an act Levi-Strauss refers to as bricolage, the taking of materials ready at hand, bricks, and recombining them into something new, like a brick wall. In fact, the content of the myth is secondary and can change all the time. But the underlying structure is primary and retained. These bundles of relations, as he called them, are fundamental and cross-conscious. Myths are good to think with and, unlike poetry, do not suffer in translation. So they can just be transferred without any problem at all. But do remember what the Indian T. Kassin said. Not even language can be transferred from one area to another one. I think that stands in contradistinction to what Saussure thought. Being a Swiss guy in the Brazilian jungle. And listen to this, it gets worse. Well, it progresses, I would say worse instead. In fact, the content of the myth is secondary and can change over time, but the underlying structure is primary and retained. These bundles of relations, as he called them, are fundamental and cross-conscious. Myths are good to think with, and unlike poetry, do not suffer in translation. All these sayings were at the time incredibly weird. It took only 30 to 40 years for them to be generally accepted. And now everybody thinks that all languages are translatable. Just use Google Translate, and then you enter into a different language world. But do remember, when Levi-Strauss put this forward, nobody accepted it. It was an invention. So he worked a little bit like a mini Newton.
But there are certain words you cannot translate.
Saussure and Levi-Strauss theories were to have an immediate effect on literary studies. Narratives were no longer simply the products of a freewheeling genius, setting his or her words down, but have deep structures within which they function and which can be interpreted. If Saussure was happy to potter with his anagrams, his index cards, and his anonymity, Levi Strauss was a very different beast. His 1955 memoir, Triste Tropique, is a work of both formidable scholarship and astonishing beauty, and establish him as one of France's most prominent intellectuals, a role he was nowise uncomfortable with. The book is a lament for a lost world, the sad tropics of the title, which he saw as dying at the hand of Western civilization.
Apocalypse, hallelujah.
In arguing that cultures exhibited structural similarities, regardless of the content of their endeavors. Levi-Strauss was also arguing that no culture can claim... Can I have a sip of the beer? Just a little bit. Sorry. I hope you're not contagious. Getting awfully thirsty here, having a lecture at the pub, accompanied by Madonna in a very high volume. It oddly started directly when the seminar started, or the lecture started. Coincidence? I don't know. The book is a lament for a lost world, the sad tropics of the title, which he saw as dying at the hand of Western civilization. Compared with Rousseau, who felt the primitive was more noble than the aristocrat. He was more pure. He was closer to the original. He was not stained or tainted by civilization, by culture, by language. Language is also something highly suspicious, especially written language. All those things are not pure as pure could be. In arguing that cultures exhibit structural similarities, regardless of the content of their endeavors, Levi-Strauss was also arguing that no culture can claim to be better than another. Does it ring a tone? Does it sound modern?
Yeah.
Do remember, nobody claimed this before him. No one. No one. It was unheard of.
It's bullshit.
No comments. Still. The culture he grew up in and that of the Nambiquara, the indigenous Brazilian tribe he studied, were equally valid. That one culture was destroying the other had no justification. They all had the same value. Is it because they have the same value? No, it's because of the grid.
Same grid pattern.
Yes. Has nothing to do with us. Has nothing to do with values. It has to do with the grid.
The underlying grid is perfect.
Very good, very good. First comment here. Very good, very good. It's because of the grid. It has nothing to do with democratizing or anything like that. It's because of the grid.
The foundation is already laid.
Yes, some foundations were already laid.
Then you can only map into for the culture.
Exactly, very good, very good. Thank you. Thank you.
Everything is equal.
Culture then is a system of symbolic communication, and the goal of structuralist analysis is to organize given data from a society in the simplest possible way, and to find the rules governing behavior. Structuralism, wrote Lévi-Strauss, is the search for unsuspected harmonies. It is the discovery of relations latent in a series of objects. And now we come to Derrida. Finally, thank you for your patience. Derrida's argument with structuralism had begun surreptitiously in 1963. The review Critique, founded in 1946 by Georges Bataille and featuring an editorial committee of Michel Diguy, Foucault and Roland Barthes, had, on the back of the success of The Origin of Geometry, offered the young philosopher space in a forthcoming edition. He proposed a response to an essay by the literary critic Jean Rousseau titled Form and Significance, an essay of literary structures from Corneille to Claudel. Rosé's essay is a work of structuralism par excellence, the very best of the best. Equaling away at finding schematic constructions which generate the works of literature, for instance, Proust, à la recherche du temps perdu, in Lookout for the Time Lost, or Times Lost. The article Derrida produced, Force and Signification, ran to over 40 pages, and Diguy initially proposed running it across 2 issues. It's a big one. But the piece was of such quality, he decided to publish the whole thing. Can you imagine? It was a big one. This was unprecedented in the journal's history. It eventually became the first essay in writing and difference, and thus the starting point for many readers of Derrida, yourself included. And it is hard to think of an opening gambit more Derridian than the first paragraph, perfectly designed to draw in the initiate and to send generations of philosophy students scampering back to analytic philosophy. Did you hear that? That happened in Sweden, actually, Norway, and Denmark, and parts of Germany. Because of the success of structuralism, everybody went back to analytic philosophy, or a lot did, giving it a revival. It's like, as we say, plague or cholera in Swedish, or Kibdis or Scylla, Charybdis or Scylla in the Greek mythology, where the Roarsman needs to stay clear of either the monsters of Scylla or Charybdis. They are both venomous and dangerous. But if you get scared of Scylla, you go to Charybdis, and this is what happens. And this is a feature that is very important to understand, because structuralism is incredibly well established in our thinking and society. The unheard of thing that all cultures value the same was unheard of before. It's a new thing. And it doesn't come from an idea of equality, it comes from the grid, as Henry so aptly put out. It has nothing to do with equality at all. Important to understand, also to understand our modern times. So listen now. If it recedes one day, leaving behind its works and signs on the shores of our civilization, the structuralist invasion might become a question for the historian of ideas, or perhaps even an object. But the historian would be deceived if he came to this pass. By the very act of reconsidering or considering the structuralist invasion as an object, he would forget its meaning and forget that what it is at stake, first of all, is an adventure of vision, a conversion of the way of outing questions to any object posed before us, to historical objects, his own in particular, and unexpectedly amongst these, the literary object, most definitely. End of the Derridian quote that scared so many, and put the foot down or the fist into the table to start post-structuralism and the deconstructionist wave that worked to encompass the whole world later. If it recedes one day, Derrida's provocation is immediate. This way of philosophizing, structuralism, will soon die. He is saying, from the vantage point of history, any way of thinking can be analyzed like this. But to do so in the very thick of it is breathtakingly presumptuous. Why? Well, you get the whole world in your grip. All of a sudden, you can understand distant tribes in Indonesia, animals living in the deep forests of Africa. You can understand human culture as it possibly was in the 16th century, Brugge in Belgium, or how seafarings is working today when it comes to navigation and so forth. It's a golden key to understand everything. Just learn the grid and apply it. You get knowledge for free. I should actually play the other band, that Money for Free, Chicks for Nothing.
Dire Straits.
Right, Dire Straits, yeah, most definitely. The essay then, with swaggering confidence, ranges across Flaubert, Gide, Freud, Bachelard, Kant, Blanchot, Eliot, Woolf, Proust, Buber, and Merleau-Ponty. God gets a look in, as do Jeremiah and St. John Chrysostom. And that's just the first half. Derrida's criticism of structuralism via Rousseau centers on the privileging of form over force. Again, this is a question about time, about the static compared to the genetic. Structuralist analysis of an literary object and mutatis mutandis, any object of its investigations. By imposing a matrix, it's the grid once more, on a particular text becomes the object itself. How gallantry! The literary thing itself. In this static reading, it's very static, it doesn't move, there is no flux here. Sentence X does not just mean the words of sentence X. It also gets its meaning from sentences Y and Z. And this can be mapped. Rhetorical question, what does this sound like?
Newton.
And Descartes. Here, Newton and Descartes, yeah, sure, Newton, yeah. we have the XYZ. Everything can be organized in the grid. And not only anthropology, sociology, politics, literary theory, semiotics, this is semiotics more or less, semantics, linguistics, cultural studies, of course today feminism and study of gender studies is absolutely structuralist or post-structuralist, taking its force from the fantastic grid. And the grid is also easy to learn. I can just show you the grid here. My dear student, Erik, apply it to the world. You can do anthropology with it, you can do Swedish, you can do cultural studies, you can do ethnography, whatever you like, Erik. The world is your lobster. You have all the choices.
Very convenient for a teacher.
It's extremely convenient for a teacher. You don't have to leave the world. You can stay at the university. Well, you don't even have to leave your house. You can stay within your head. Private language once more. So I think you can understand here also how Wittgenstein comes into the whole thing. We need this teaching. We need the 1500 episodes to open up to the understanding of Wittgenstein. It would never, I swear, Wittgenstein would never ever been understandable to me without Lee Smolin and Roberto Unger, as I mentioned before. But neither without Jacques Derrida, Lacan, the little I studied with him. Very helpful with Roland Barthes. Very helpful. He's more of a structuralist, so it's easier to get into the fantastic grid system. Maybe if they haven't closed, we can go to Claes Olsson, recommended here, or was it Cello Company, to look for a new tripod. But maybe they also have the matrix for doing structural studies. Maybe they sell it for 5 crowns. A photocopy of a structure, and Claes Olsson himself says, do apply it to everything you want. The family structure, the difference between gay and non-gay, the difference between the social classes, upper class, the difference between mammals and lizards, fish. Everything that there's a resemblance to have a difference. Without perhaps with the exception of jellyfish. No, even jellyfish could be incorporated into the matrix. Actually, nothing escapes the matrix. Just as in the movie, I think Neo said that. Nothing escapes the matrix. So, questionnaire.
It sounds a bit like imperialism, like an imperialistic attitude with this grid type, I think. What would you say?
I think you have a bad lighting here. It sounds like
imperialism.
Yeah, I would say.
Like it's born from some kind of imperialism.
Please repeat.